Thank you, Luc, and good afternoon to everybody. Yeah, first of all, I'm quite happy to have the chance to discuss and to have the possibility to tell a little bit about marine pollution in the Black Sea, because it's a trip down memory lane for me. About 10 years ago, I was quite active in Bulgaria, dealing with the implementation of, at that time, integrated river basin planning, of which, of course, spatial planning on land was an important issue in the coastal areas of Varna and Burgas. And I see some quite familiar names in the virtual audience, so quite good to somehow see you back, although, of course, I guess everybody would have loved doing that in a more physical setting. Maybe bring it even a bit further back in memory lane. I remember about 2005 when we started doing some maritime spatial planning exercises in the North Sea, and especially in Belgium. Those were, let's say, the first wave of the ideas, trying to implement these spatial planning ideas in an environment, well, a completely sea environment. Nice work, but I would say at that point quite separated in terms of any link with land, let alone with coast. It was, I would say, a first attempt. What you see now is what I call then a sort of second wave of maritime spatial planning. On the one hand, because a quite intensive use of the sea, and more resources are being used. On the other hand, everybody indeed is seeing the importance of linking maritime activities with land-based activities, especially if, for instance, I'm a bit more involved in coastal development or harbor development, which is quite obvious, of course, but as pointed out by the previous speaker, these links are quite more intensive. Today I was asked to bring you some introductory notes about marine pollution. So I will focus on that. That's only, of course, one aspect of the area in which maritime spatial planning and land-sea interaction is important. Unfortunately, often a negative situation. So I will limit myself to that today. Next slide, please. And if you start talking about maritime pollution and you live in the European Union, you're sort of morally obliged, I would say, to start with the European Maritime Framework, or the Strategy Directive, which is then in marine environment, I would say the brother or the sister of the Water Framework Directive, and is really has been a turning point in terms of developing a common strategy to address maritime pollution and also, of course, other aspects. It dates back from 2008 already, yeah, so that's 12 years ago. And yeah, with 2020 today, that was at that point in time, the ambitious goal of the European Union to have a good ecological quality by the end of this year, so quite close by. And as we all know, of course, it was a bit too over-ambitious, as in most areas, we are not reaching yet this ecological good quality. As you can see on the slide, a typical, I would say, process of trying to assess the state of the marine waters is shown here in this figure. First of all, you try to assess what the quality is. You develop together where do you want to go and what is that good environmental status. Not always obvious, certainly not in those locations close to the coast, for instance, where the marine pollution is sort of hampering the possibility of still knowing what that good environmental status is. You set those targets together. Mostly environmental targets, but of course quite linked to the socioeconomic development. And then you come up with programs and you try, of course, to implement these actions. And as you all know, probably this in the European Union, we have this 6-year cycle where we try to implement, monitor, and have this cycle, 5-step cycle renewed. This directive lists, in fact, 4 European marine regions, among which the Baltic Sea. The other ones are the Northeast Atlantic, Mediterranean, and of course the Black Sea. And they are not chosen by accident. Most of them are already, I would say, or were already formed thanks to existing regional sea conventions. And the idea is, of course, that cooperation in these 4 regions is carried out with neighboring countries. In the case of the Black Sea, as quite obvious, not every country is part of the EU, so it's also the idea to try to work together with on a transboundary scale with those countries which are not part of the EU. Next slide, please. If we are talking about marine pollution, it's always important to state that there has been quite some international legislation and I would say frameworks of cooperation in the past. An important role there was for the International Maritime Organization, IMO, which is in fact part of the United Nations, and even since in 1954, and so already more than 50 years ago, they started with the startup of these conventions to prevent pollution of the sea, for instance, in this case, by oil. Another important aspect to consider is MARPOL, which is then, in fact, also an international convention relating in fact to the maritime pollution produced by ships, which has been renewed a few times since then. And there's a number of other specific legislations dealing with some specific aspect that is causing, or specific sector that is causing pollution. So there has been quite some history of knowledge on the issue and ideas on how to solve it and how to collaborate in an international setting. Unfortunately, that has not always resulted in appropriate action, I would say, on the seafloor. And taking the necessary remedial action. On the regional scale, a bit linked to what I was saying about these 4 sea regions, there has been a history of these regional conventions. It started a bit with the OSPAR Convention in the Northeast Atlantic, and then it was also taken place in the other relevant sea organizations, and specifically for the Black Sea, we are talking about the Bucharest Convention, which was a milestone in that respect. So in terms of international or regional legislation, one could conclude that from the beginning, in fact, it has been taken into account that both marine activities as well as land-based activities were important when dealing with the assessment of the environmental status and when dealing with the necessity of formulation of measures to reduce pollution. So regarding legal and administrative frameworks, I would say everything is set in place in order to be able to tackle the problem. Next slide, please. Of course, if one is talking about pollution, it's important to not put the blame on, but to link it at least to the sectors which are active in that sea, around the coast, even on land, and causing to some extent this pollution problem. And also in that respect, quite extensive work has been done in the framework of the Marine Strategy Directive, and not only in that framework, but especially related to that. And necessary overviews are available in order to link the different activities that are causing a specific source of pollution, as shown simply by this graph as an illustration. We are talking about renewable energy, we are talking about forms of extraction, mariculture, so aquaculture at sea, but of course even the use of ships and transport as such, or physical presence of coastal defense structures of harbors is causing certainly some degree of pollution. It's necessary to link or to be aware of these anthropogenic pressures, but it's of course more necessary to come up with the necessary measures, either sector by sector or interlinked, in order to reduce their importance related to pollution. Next slide, please. If we then zoom in a bit to the sea environment and look on the, I would say, the risk or the pollution side, it's clear that the Black Sea, especially, it remains quite impacted, and we have the pleasure today, I think, of the possibility to listen to some experts which are quite well placed to be able to bring you into more depth the status of the Black Sea, and also the relationship of the sectors with specific aspects of pollution. And because of course also pollution is only, I would say, a container term for different problems of pollution, of which you see an illustration on the left side here of the presentation. Are we talking about specific forms of chemical pollution? Are we talking about marine litter? Are we talking now a new form of pollution, underwater noise, and specifically, for instance, related to renewable energy, jelly blooms, etc. So also there, it's important to distinguish all these forms which are unfortunately also present in the Black Sea, and to be able to link them to these sectors. If we're looking at these sectors, and we all know that population is an important aspect, land-based population in this case. In some countries around the Black Sea, population is growing. In other ones, it's decreasing along the coast. The coastal erosion issue is present in the Black Sea. Tourism activities are causing pollution. Food processing, other kind of industrial activities, agriculture, transport, specifically of oil, shipping, this kind of stuff is all producing a certain degree of marine pollution in the Black Sea. And we have to acknowledge, although research has been done, that there is a need for more knowledge on the Black Sea ecosystems and the link between sectors and the different pollution problems. And I believe we have the opportunity today to listen, for instance, to the MBLAS project, but also other projects have been trying to deal with this problem. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the, to give you a small overview on the availability of measures, again, I'm starting here with specifically for the EU countries. As mentioned, the Marine Strategy Directive has set the need to develop a program of measures that should have been adopted since 2017, so that has been in place now a few years, and in which certain measures are specifically aimed at the reduction of marine pollution. In certain areas that are protected for, I would say, nature reasons, and the special protected areas related to the Birds Directive, another EU directive, and the special areas of conservation, which is related to the Habitat Directive. You can even go a step further, and as a member state, you can adopt very specific and very strong measures, even, for instance, not allowing certain socioeconomic activities in these areas. And this was, I would say, in the past simply done by, I would say, indeed, by not allowing this kind of activities. Of course, you have always a degree of mixing with the surrounding environment. But what you see now is because of the extreme pressure on the sea, although it seems vast, that we seem to be lacking in certain countries already enough space at sea, that even in these special protected areas, the necessity to allow certain socioeconomic activities is popping up, which again emphasizes the need to implement these kind of socioeconomic activities without severe pollution. If we're talking about type of measures, on the one hand, you could say you're talking about source measures, typically, for instance, related to land-based pollution and trying to come up with the necessary wastewater treatment. On the other hand, the necessity of end-of-pipe measures is still there. So still, if, for instance, the ballast water of a ship is something to deal with end of pipe, and both type of measures and everything in between, I would say, will be necessary to implement further and to a larger extent in the future. Now, this is, I would say, induced by EU legislation. On the other hand, I started by talking about a lot of international legislation. And also this type of international conventions has led to a certain degree to, I would say, reduction of pollution. The typical example there is the ban of TBT use for on ships, which has certainly decreased quite a lot the presence of TBT in marine waters. Now, I'm also quite eager to hear today how marine spatial planning and a better land-sea interaction knowledge can lead to, I would say, a horizontal and a cross-sectional approach on these measures, these sectoral measures to reduce pollution. Next slide, please. This brings me to the future. To my, I would say, my personal view is that the Black Sea Commission haven't used the word yet, but everybody involved knows the high importance of this Black Sea Commission, that they will remain very important and have a crucial role, especially related to this topic of marine pollution. It's, I would say, the pivot on which the collaboration and the necessary knowledge exchange between the Black Sea countries is taking place. Recently, both these Black Sea countries as well as the EU signed this SRIA, Strategic Research and Innovation Agenda for the Black Sea. And although it's a bit broader, specific aspects relevant for today are, for instance, the necessity or the fact that they make very clear that it's quite important to integrate land-sea interaction when dealing with issues related to the deep Black Sea basin. A very important one, I think, is the fact that they emphasize the necessity of promoting ocean-engaged citizens to include, I would say, the social aspect into this more technical environment, and also the necessity for innovation in the blue sector, not only, I would say, purely economical innovation, but also socio-ecological innovation, trying to come up with really sustainable developments in these maritime activities in order to, let's say, reduce the issue of pollution. That brings me, in fact, to my conclusion. I think I have hoped to give you some insights on marine pollution, specifically related to the interaction between land and sea. It is a complex matter. It was already a complex matter when dealing with it separately, but still we need to overcome that complexity, and by, I would say, making it a common approach, making it a common effort, and by exchanging knowledge and by coming up with, I would say, combined effort of measures over the different countries and over the different sectors and stakeholders, that will be the only solution to overcome the challenges of this complex issue of marine pollution.